Hello, you magnificent bastards! Glad you tuned in. I am Dr. Layman, and today's topic is a response video to Armoured Skeptic's video on postmodernism. Now, since the last video of mine didn't go too well, I was a bit too mean to Armoured Skeptic to hand you over the very first ever Excellence in Ignorance award. In fact, you know what? Have all of them. You deserve them. Let's do it properly this time. Let's start off with something positive to show goodwill. I am not ashamed to admit that I really like his presentation. I think that his presentation is way better than mine ever could be, and I also think that his intro kicks my intro's ass. Let's just watch that for a second here, okay? I mean, no contest here, right? So I don't really like doing long introductory speeches and all that mumbo-jumbo, so let's get right down to business. Armoured Skeptic, also known as Greg or Gregory, I'm just gonna call him Greg for the purposes of this video. Greg made a video where he tried to explain postmodernism, and that's it. That's the intro. Alrighty then, let's get red-pilled by Greg on postmodernism.
In the last episode of Skeptic Explains, I asked for you to write questions for me to answer in the comments section, and one of the examples that I gave was, what is postmodernism? Now I realize this isn't fair, and it wasn't exactly the most popular question that I got, but lots of you did ask that exact question. So, what is postmodernism? Is postmodernism bad?
The question of, is postmodernism bad, before even defining it, actually represents the overall level of discussion surrounding postmodernism on YouTube really well. I assume Greg chose this just as a rhetorical device, but he's actually touching upon a big issue with it, probably without even realizing so. Asking whether or not a really broad assortment of artistic, philosophical, and literary movements that often contradict each other is bad before even defining it. I mean, it's honestly like asking, is painting bad? Or is swimming bad? Bad for who? When? What part of it exactly? Under what conditions? How about we try to understand it first before we go for the is it good or is it bad question. If you've come to a conclusion on something without having done basic research into it, and I don't mean reading the summary of a Wikipedia article and then watching a 3-minute essay on it by Smash Cultural Marxism 1488, if you've not done proper research and you are still commenting on it, you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. I think that no matter what I do or say at this point, so many of you watching this video already have their minds made up to such a level of fanaticism that you can't even entertain the idea that there actually may, potentially, be more to postmodernism than your favorite low-hanging social justice fruit and shitty money laundering schemes called postmodern paintings. So let's play a game. It's a game I call Spot the Postmodernism, and it's about postmodern architecture. I'm going to show you 3 buildings, and you tell me in the comment section which one of those buildings is quote-unquote postmodern, and you'll tell me if you like any of those buildings. Ready? Okay, here we go. I mean, this one is admittedly kinda tricky, but I mean, they all look kinda solid, but you know, one of them looks kinda odd, doesn't it? Right, time's up. Be sure to pause the video here and give me a nice comment with your guess and what you think of the buildings. I assume you want to know which one of them is the postmodern one. Well, all of them. All of them are postmodern. The first one is the MI6 building in London, second one is the Egan Center, and the last one is the Haas School of Business. And all of them are actually great examples of postmodern architecture. Okay, I know that was a bit dishonest with all the trickery going on. Let's try again. Which one of those 3 buildings is postmodern? Take your time, this time it should be really obvious, right? Think about it and write me a comment which one it is and what you think of them. Okie dokie, time is up. Right, so which one of them is postmodern? If you thought this one, the Sydney Opera House, I've got to disappoint you. Not a single one of them is actually postmodern. All of the examples provided here, and again, sorry again for the sort of trickery here. All of the examples provided, the Goethe University main building, the Bauhaus building in Dessau, and the Opera Hall in Sydney, they are all examples of modern architecture. Now, what point am I trying to get across here? It's not that modern and postmodern architecture is always pleasant. All I'm trying to do here is to show you how broad the concepts of modernism and postmodernism are in architecture alone, and how fuzzy and complicated the definitions are. Honestly, even talking about postmodern architecture alone deserves at least an hour-long video, and that's the really short version of it. And Greg, I'm sorry that I'm using your video to segue into this aspect of the debate, but I think that you too, as we will see throughout your video, have fallen victim to this super reductionist, naive, one-sided, and flat out speaking narrow-minded outlook on postmodernism, which really is a shame, because you clearly can do so much better. But enough of me, Greg, do your thing.
Is postmodernism bad? Yep. Okay, sort of. Not exactly. Postmodernism is a method of philosophical thought. It's a lens to view the world through.
Now, at this point, whether knowingly or not, Greg tells us that he's dealing with postmodern philosophy. And that's really important to know, because if you think back to my earlier segment, there's postmodern art, music, literature, philosophy, architecture, and so much more. Narrowing it down to philosophy is a good start, but sadly, and this may come as a spoiler, but neither in his video directly, nor in his description does Greg give a single source for anything he's saying. And that actually is a really big problem. He's essentially talking about a phenomenon that is unbelievably huge, but also exceptionally well documented. And he's doing that without referring to a single piece of that documentation, a single academic source. Yeah, this is going to be a bit of a quote bump, but please stick with me. After having understood what I'll be trying to tell you, you will have a better understanding of postmodernism than about, say, 98% of all people on YouTube. And that is not a real statistic, it's just a figure of speech. In the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, we'll find the following entry for postmodernism. However, it can be described as a set of critical, strategic, and rhetorical practices employing concepts such as difference, repetition, the trace, the simulacrum, and hyperreality to destabilize other concepts such as presence, identity, historical progress, epistemic certainty, and the univocity of meaning. For someone that's not educated in philosophy, that's admittedly a bit complicated, especially terms like simulacrum and hyperreality, even though being super important, are just not suitable for a sort of first entry into the field. So for now, let's keep in mind it's about destabilizing a few sort of certainties by employing some really weird stuff, and let's look at a more digestible source. Madeleine Sarup's Introductory Guide to Post-Structuralism and Postmodernism from 1993. Here we'll find the following definition. Postmodernism is the name for a movement in advanced capitalist culture, particularly in the arts. The term postmodernism originated amongst artists and critics in New York in the 1960s and was taken up by European theorists in the 1970s. Jean-François Lyotard, in a famous book entitled The Postmodern Condition, attacked the legitimating myths of the modern age, the so-called grand narratives, the progressive liberation of humanity through science, and the idea that philosophy can restore unity to learning and develop universally valid knowledge for humanity. As a bit of somewhat related trivia at this point, especially regarding the last bit on universally valid knowledge, and to break up the monotony of definitions, it really seems to be the case that people don't really care about what, quote-unquote, objectively actually happened, and much more care about what they think that happened. And no amount of philosophy will probably be able to reconcile this. For example, in the somewhat infamous 2005 study Political Affiliation and Presidential Debates by Jarman, we actually find that during presidential debates, Democrats rated the Democratic candidate higher and think that he won the debate, while Republicans rate the Republican candidate higher and think that he won the debate. This trend of perception not only influencing, but straight up shaping reality appears largely consistent in most life situations. But that's just a bit of trivia to keep you entertained. Back to the definition of postmodernism. Yay! Now, both of the previous main sources mention Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, and if we look into it directly, we'll find the following. I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. This incredulity is undoubtedly a product of progress in the sciences, but that progress in turn presupposes it. Alrighty then, so postmodernism is about destabilizing certain concepts, namely so-called meta-narratives. At this point, the only one piece of the definition puzzle is still missing, and that's the definition of said meta-narratives, which I promise is the last quote in this segment. If we move to Oxford reference, we'll find the following explanation for what a meta-narrative is. It's Lyotard's term for the totalizing narratives or meta-discourses of modernity, which have provided ideologies with a legitimating philosophy of history. For example, the grand narratives of the Enlightenment, democracy, and Marxism. Boom! There you go! If you add all the aforementioned partial definitions together, you get a really basic, simple, but also useful definition. Postmodernism is a movement starting in the 1960s in New York as a response to modernism surrendering to essentially mainstream influences, and is first picked up by European theorists in the 1970s. Amongst other things, such as a rejection of objective knowledge and naive scientism, it's also a critical refusal of grand narratives, which essentially are big stories we tell ourselves about how the world works and how history has evolved, in order to legitimize something. For example, the grand narratives of Marxism, democracy, and Enlightenment. Congratulations, you now know more than most people on YouTube. That's me clapping, by the way. And just to be clear here, this is absolute bare-bones research. This is like the absolute minimum you have to provide if you want to talk about postmodernism. I also realize that concepts like hyperreality and simulacrum are super crucial for postmodernism, but the video is long enough as it is. Let's just stick with this really simple bare-bones definition. And let's also continue with Greg's video.
On its own, it's harmless. It's sort of like a thought experiment. From a historical standpoint, it's very interesting to watch the great debate that postmodernism has started. And, evolutionarily, it makes sense that it's so prevalent in politics, entertainment, and education today. Love it or hate it, postmodernism is likely here to stay.
Well, in reality, postmodernism is pretty old at this point, and it's kinda dying out. We're already seeing the rise of so-called post-postmodernism or metamodernism, both often being a weird sorta synthesis of postmodernism and modernism. If you want a little bit more literature on that, check out Notes on Metamodernism by Vermeulen or Vermeulen. I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce the name. Shame on me. I personally am not educated enough in this specific field to give you a good summary, so yeah, take a moment and read the paper. And let's also get back to Graff.
You should learn what it is. Postmodernism was a movement that was born as a response to modernism. So we need to have a little refresher course on modernism to get a proper picture of where postmodernism is today. Modernism was a movement that was born as a response to the way that industrialization had... This could go on for days. Let's just do a short history lesson.
Yay! I absolutely love short history lessons, and I really wish I had a popcorn sound. I hope I can find a free one. But don't mind me, go on.
In a nutshell, I'm just gonna paint a picture for you. The world used to be ruled by monarchs, kings, queens, pharaohs, popes, what have you. But as technologies improved and communication became easier for lower class people, it became easier for the general public to learn about more abstract concepts. The very concept of philosophy even became more widespread among normal, everyday people. It led to the general public becoming more aware and frustrated with the monarchy and the aristocrats that had most of the power and money. This led to a period known as the Enlightenment era. It was kind of the red pill of the 18th century.
You know, your choice of people to show in this picture is really interesting, and actually kinda contradicts the point you were trying to make, with the exception of Diderot and Kant, who weren't as wealthy, but still. Everyone in your picture is a member of the upper middle class, if not the upper class proper. In fact, everyone in this picture has a college education or equivalent and was either a landowner like Jefferson or practiced some higher education occupation like Edmund Burke, who was both member of parliament and served as a paymaster of the British forces for a time. The idea that the Enlightenment, as you put it, led to all classes of people suddenly being able to do philosophy and politics is almost fictional. Of course, there was some degree of proliferation of philosophy, but it's not as if suddenly, out of nowhere, every worker became a philosopher. And even if we do have this proliferation, it's not as if philosophy was always only an upper-class endeavor that was made accessible for the lower classes only through the Enlightenment. Some really influential ancient philosophers actually have a really poor background. Socrates was born to a stonemason and a midwife. Diogenes of Sinope was born to a coin minter. Jesus fucking Christ! You know, my throat really hurts. I don't know if you can tell, but it really, really hurts. Greg, this is the level of love that I have for you. And no, I'm not gonna do another take because my throat is fucking... My throat is basically a Teutoburg fucking forest. And my voice is the Roman legions. I don't know where I'm going with this one, okay? I'm tired and I'm fucking sick. Anyways, back to Diogenes of Sinope. He was born to a coin minter, debased some currency, and spent the rest of his life in ascetic poverty, sleeping in a ceramic barrel and masturbating in public. And if we move to a philosopher of almost the same name, Diogenes of Lyotard, he describes in his book Lives of Eminent Philosophers, Book 4, Chapter 7, a certain Bion of Borysthenes, who, well, let's just read the first part of the chapter. Bion, or Bion, was by birth a citizen of Borysthenes. Who his parents were, and what his circumstances before he took to philosophy, he himself told Antigonus in plain terms. For when Antigonus inquired, "Who among men, and whence are you? What is your city, and your parents?" He, knowing that he had already been maligned to the king, replied, "My father was a freedman who wiped his nose on his sleeve," meaning that he was a dealer in saltfish, a native of Borysthenes with no face to show, but only the writing on his face, a token of his master's severity. "My mother was such as a man like my father would marry, from a brothel. Afterwards my father, who had cheated the revenue in some way, was sold with all his family, and I, then a not ungraceful youngster, was bought by a certain rhetorician, who on his death left me all he had, and I burned his books, scraped everything together, came to Athens, and turned philosopher." So yeah, this philosopher actually used to be a slave in ancient Greece, but he still made it. Unknowingly, and now we're getting into the main part of my criticism of Greg's video, unknowingly, Greg actually gives a really good example of what postmodernism criticizes as a grand narrative. The idea that enlightenment is a sudden, monolithic, one-way progression, when the actual truth is much, much more muddied, ugly, and doesn't fit any nice little narrative. Also, as a fun fact, this guy right here, Immanuel Kant, is often cited as one of the central influences of modern and even postmodern thinking. You know, just as a little bit of trivia here.
Enlightenment spawned a hatred for monarchy and religious authority, and a lot of simple modern concepts were born of it, like liberty, freedom, tolerance, progression, constitutional government, and the separation of church and state, as well as things like deductive reasoning, logic, the scientific method, even objective truth.
It's really funny that you selected those 4 concepts, because 3 of them actually fit my part about ancient philosophers really well. Deductive reasoning and logic both originate with Aristotle, namely in posterior analytics. At least if we're talking about formal logic. Greg's umbrella use of the term logic here makes this entire thing sadly seem even more uneducated. And I don't mean that as an insult. There's no shame in being uneducated on stuff. I, for example, am completely uneducated on chemistry, so I don't make videos on it. Anyway, considering there are many different logics for many different applications, epistemic logic, deontic logic, Boolean logic, and temporal logic, just to name a very select few, you should always clarify what kind of logic you are referring to. Because as it stands, saying that logic originated in the Enlightenment, it's sadly flat out wrong. and even objective truth can be traced to ancient philosophy as well, namely to Plato. If anything, the Enlightenment actually saw a rise of various subjective truth concepts, because the concept of objective truth was dominant mostly before that. But that's a matter for another video. The one thing you did get right here, Greg, is the scientific method. That is actually a result of Enlightenment thinking. I could nitpick about it being an extension of philosophy of nature, but I'm not gonna do that, right? No, you are right, result of the Enlightenment period. Still, 3 of those points you made exist independent of the Enlightenment and predate it by more than 2,000 years.
Naturally, this is how God died, as Nietzsche put it. The world was not only just more secular now, atheism was becoming more widespread. People were no longer driven by their identity based on religion, and they were now driven by identifying with other concepts like patriotism, capitalism, communism, fascism. Knowledge was expanding, the world was mapped. Technologies were improving life. Society was becoming more organized and institutionalized. Art was challenging conventions, and it also brought concepts like the American dream. Modernism had turned into a unified concept of progress and development through logic and scientific endeavor. Modernism led to great achievements like the moon landing. Wait, no, that was a hoax. The idea was institutions knew best.
Greg, stop. I mean, okay, listen. This part, up until now, even including the philosophers, wasn't too bad. Sure, a few nitpicks here and there, but meh, who cares, right? Who cares? But you just dropped the ball. Really, really hard. I genuinely don't think you can drop the ball harder. And I'm not saying this to attack you, I genuinely mean this, sadly. Let's look at some actual academic sources real quick. John Barth, even though focusing mostly on literature, gives us a few insights about modernism in the 1979 book The Literature of Replenishment. The ground motive of modernism, Graff asserts, was criticism of the 19th century bourgeois social order and its worldview. Its artistic strategy was the self-conscious overturning of the conventions of bourgeois realism by such tactics and devices as the substitution of a mythical for a realistic method and the manipulation of conscious parallels between contemporaneity and antiquity. A bit later, and far more importantly, he then continues to talk about postmodernism, but also describes a few interesting core factors of modernism. For Graff too, postmodern fiction simply carries to its logical and questionable extremes the anti-rationalist, anti-realist, anti-bourgeois program of modernism, but with neither a solid adversary, the bourgeoisie having now everywhere co-opted the trappings of modernism and turned its defined principles into mass media kitsch, nor solid moorings in the quotidian realism it defines itself against. Modernism is anti-everything. Everything you just described, Greg. By the way, you could of course read Graff directly. I mean, he's quoted here 2 times. You'll find most of his stuff in his 1973 and 1978 works, the first one being Aestheticism and Cultural Politicism, but I personally had trouble following him and or understanding him, so I can't recommend him with a clear conscience. If you personally want to read his stuff, as always, just scroll down. It's in the description for free. Wherever you go in terms of modernism, the one thing it always has in common is a rejection of logic, objective truth, and science. I mean, if you look at some of the most prominent pieces of modern art, this actually should be pretty evident. This quote-unquote movement then exploded after the First World War because, well, it's a rejection of reason and logic, and how else do you handle the up until then worst war ever? The First World War, and I think that's something that we nowadays don't really understand on an emotional level. The First World War was an absolutely traumatic event for all participants. Never before was warfare as horrible and as efficient as then. Well, you can make an argument for various Mongol incursions, but I'm gonna leave that to people criticizing this video. You know, you gotta keep stuff open so people can kick my ass, because I definitely could use it, I think. These nightmarish experiences of the First World War intensified the modernist rejection of realism, rationalism, and logic even more. I genuinely don't know where anyone can get the idea from that modernism was some kind of golden age of rational and scientific thought. It's the complete opposite, actually.